Russian diplomat demands royal guard move aside. The guard's one-word response went viral. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red uniform one final time. 23 years he'd stood at this post, through rain and shine, watching the world change around him while he remained steadfast as stone. His weathered hands, scarred from a childhood accident, gripped his rifle with practiced ease. At 51, Thomas had seen diplomats from every corner of the earth approach these gates, some with respect, others with arrogance that made his jaw clench. But nothing had prepared him for what would happen on this crisp October morning. A black Mercedes with diplomatic plates pulled up, and out stepped Viktor Petrov, Russia's most notorious ambassador. The man's cold eyes surveyed the palace grounds like he owned them, his expensive coat billowing in the autumn breeze. Thomas felt something stir in his chest, a protective instinct that had kept him standing guard for over 2 decades. "Where are you watching from today?" Thomas had grown up in a small Welsh mining town where respect wasn't given, it was earned through honest work and decent character. His father, a coal miner with hands black as midnight, had taught him that a man's worth came from his integrity, not his title. When Thomas joined the Queen's Guard at 18, he carried those values with him like armor. The palace grounds buzzed with quiet activity that morning. Tourists snapped photos from beyond the iron gates, their cameras clicking like mechanical heartbeats. Thomas stood motionless, his expression carved from granite, watching everything while appearing to see nothing. It was a skill he'd perfected over the years, the art of silent observation. Viktor Petrov approached the main entrance with the swagger of a man accustomed to having doors opened before he reached them. His entourage followed like shadows, 2 assistants clutching briefcases and a security detail that moved with military precision. Petrov's reputation preceded him wherever he went. The diplomatic community whispered about his methods, how he bulldozed through negotiations, treating smaller nations like chess pieces on his personal board. "You there," Petrov called out in accented English, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been told no. "Move aside. I have urgent business with Her Majesty." Thomas didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, following protocol that had been drilled into him thousands of times. The Queen's Guard didn't move for anyone without proper clearance. Not for celebrities, not for politicians, and certainly not for diplomats who forgot their manners. Petrov stepped closer, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the stone. "Did you hear me, soldier? I am Ambassador Viktor Petrov. I demand immediate access." The morning air seemed to thicken around them. Other guards remained at their posts, but Thomas could feel their attention shifting his way. Palace staff paused in their duties, sensing the tension building like storm clouds before thunder. Thomas had met men like Petrov before, powerful figures who believed their status entitled them to special treatment. During his years of service, he'd watched diplomats try to bypass security, celebrities demand private tours, and wealthy tourists attempt to bribe their way into restricted areas. Each time, Thomas had stood firm, knowing that his duty transcended any individual's convenience. "I will not ask again," Petrov declared, his voice rising with irritation. "Stand aside immediately, or there will be consequences." A small crowd of tourists began to gather, their phones emerging from pockets as they sensed something unusual unfolding. Thomas felt their eyes on him, but his training kept him steady. He thought of his father's words, "When someone tries to make you small, son, stand taller." Petrov turned to his assistant, a nervous young woman who kept glancing between her boss and the immovable guard. "Contact the Foreign Office," he ordered. "Tell them we have an incident here." The assistant fumbled with her phone, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. Thomas noticed her hands trembling slightly. She understood the gravity of what was happening, even if her boss didn't. Years of diplomatic experience had taught Petrov that intimidation usually worked. He'd seen lesser officials crumble under his demanding tone, watched security guards step aside when faced with his credentials and threats. But Thomas Mitchell wasn't like other men. His resolve had been forged in the coal mines of Wales and tempered through decades of faithful service. "Young man," Petrov said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "do you understand who I am? One phone call from me could end your career. I have connections that reach the highest levels of your government. Thomas felt something shift inside him, not fear, but a deeper understanding of what this moment represented. This wasn't just about following protocol anymore. It was about dignity, respect, and the principles his father had taught him in that small Welsh town so many years ago. The autumn wind picked up, rustling through the trees that lined the palace grounds. Leaves danced across the cobblestones like nature's confetti, and for a moment, Thomas thought about all the seasons he'd witnessed from this post. He'd stood guard through royal weddings, state funerals, and countless diplomatic meetings. He'd seen history unfold before his eyes, always faithful, always steady. But this morning felt different. The weight of tradition, duty, and personal honor converged in a single moment that would define not just his career, but his legacy. The crowd of tourists grew larger, their whispered conversations creating a low hum of anticipation. Thomas could hear fragments of their discussions, American accents wondering what was happening, elderly voices expressing concern for the guard's position. A grandmother with silver hair reminded her grandson to show respect for the soldier, her words carrying across the morning air like a blessing. Petrov's patience evaporated like morning dew. He stepped directly in front of Thomas, close enough that the guard could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the scent of frustration. "This is your final warning," the ambassador hissed. "Move, or face the consequences." Thomas thought of his daughter Emma, now 25 and working as a nurse in London. She'd inherited her father's stubborn streak and her grandfather's sense of justice. Just last week, she'd told him how proud she was of his service, how his dedication to duty had inspired her own commitment to helping others. The memory of her words strengthened his resolve. The diplomatic crisis was escalating beyond anyone's expectations. Palace security began moving into position, their trained eyes assessing the situation while maintaining appropriate distance. They knew Thomas well, respected his judgment and trusted his ability to handle difficult situations. But this was different. Ambassador Petrov wasn't just another difficult visitor. He represented a major world power, and any incident could have international ramifications. Thomas remembered his training officer's words from decades ago: "A Queen's Guard doesn't just protect a building, son. He protects tradition, honor, and everything this uniform represents." Suddenly, a revelation struck Thomas like lightning. He recognized something in Petrov's eyes, a desperate urgency that went beyond mere arrogance. The ambassador wasn't just being difficult, he was genuinely panicked about something. Years of reading people had taught Thomas to look beyond surface behavior, and what he saw now was a man under tremendous pressure. The realization didn't change Thomas's duty, but it added complexity to the moment. Whatever drove Petrov's urgency, it couldn't override established protocol. The Queen's security wasn't negotiable, regardless of anyone's personal crisis. A young boy in the crowd tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing at Thomas. "Mommy, why won't the soldier move?" The innocent question carried across the courtyard, and Thomas felt the weight of all those watching eyes. He was no longer just a guard doing his job, he'd become a symbol of something larger. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. The palace staff watched nervously from their positions. They'd seen diplomatic incidents before, but never one that felt so personal, so charged with unspoken tension. Thomas had become more than a colleague to them over the years. He was a fixture, a reliable presence who embodied the best qualities of his position. Petrov pulled out his phone, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen. "I'm calling your superior," he declared. "This insubordination will not be tolerated." Thomas felt a flutter of concern for the first time. He'd followed protocol perfectly, but he understood that powerful men like Petrov could make life difficult for ordinary people. His pension, his daughter's respect, his own sense of identity, everything seemed to hang in the balance of this single confrontation. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the palace grounds. The golden light caught the medals on Thomas's chest, reminders of his faithful service through the years. Each decoration told a story of dedication, of moments when he'd chosen duty over convenience, honor over ease. As Petrov continued his phone call, speaking in rapid Russian to someone on the other end, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He would not just follow his training, he would follow his heart, guided by the values his father had taught him in that small Welsh mining town. The crowd sensed something momentous approaching. Cameras remained ready, eyes stayed focused on the two men locked in this battle of wills. History was about to be made, though none of them, not even Thomas himself, could have predicted exactly how. The phone call ended with Petrov's face flushed red with anger and something else, fear. Thomas's trained eye caught the subtle change in the ambassador's demeanor. Whatever conversation had just taken place, it hadn't gone as Petrov expected. The powerful diplomat suddenly looked smaller, more vulnerable. "Your commanding officer will hear about this," Petrov said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You have no idea what you've done." Thomas felt a stirring of unexpected sympathy. He'd seen that look before, in his father's eyes the night the mine closed, in his own mirror the day his wife passed away from cancer 3 years ago. It was the face of a man watching his world crumble, regardless of the expensive suit and diplomatic credentials. The crowd had swelled to nearly 50 people now, their phones capturing every moment. Thomas realized this confrontation was being broadcast to the world in real time, shared across social media platforms he barely understood. His daughter had tried to explain Twitter and Facebook to him, but he'd never imagined becoming part of their digital landscape. A memory surfaced, his wife Margaret's final days in the hospital. She'd been so proud of his uniform, always straightening his medals when he visited after his shifts. "You stand for something important, Thomas," she'd whispered during one of their last conversations. "Never forget that people need to believe in something bigger than themselves." The autumn wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. Thomas closed his eyes for just a moment, drawing strength from Margaret's memory. When he opened them again, he saw Petrov differently, not as an enemy, but as another human being struggling with circumstances beyond his control. "Please," Petrov said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "You don't understand. My daughter, she's in trouble. I need to reach the Queen directly. It's a matter of life and death." The admission hung in the air like morning mist. Thomas felt his heart skip, remembering every sleepless night he'd spent worrying about Emma's safety in London. Parenthood created a vulnerability that transcended nationality, politics, and protocol. But duty remained duty, even in the face of human suffering. The palace security team stepped closer, their radios crackling with updates from supervisors monitoring the situation. Thomas could hear his commanding officer's voice requesting a status report. Soon, this decision would be taken out of his hands entirely. An elderly woman in the crowd called out, "God bless you, soldier." Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd lived through wars, who understood sacrifice and duty. Thomas felt a surge of pride mixed with crushing responsibility. Petrov's assistant approached cautiously, her clipboard trembling in her hands. "Sir," she said quietly, "perhaps we could go through proper channels? I have contacts at—" "There's no time," Petrov snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "I'm sorry, Katerina. I'm not angry with you." Thomas noticed the kindness beneath Petrov's frustration, how he apologized to his assistant, how his anger transformed into protective desperation when speaking of his daughter. These weren't the actions of a heartless diplomat, they were the reflexes of a frightened father. The guard thought of his own daughter's recent phone call, how Emma had mentioned working late shifts at the hospital, walking alone to her car through darkened parking lots. Every parent carried the same fears, regardless of their position in the world. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Palace staff gathered at nearby windows, watching the unprecedented scene unfold. Thomas had become a legend among them over the years, the guard who never wavered, who treated everyone with respect while maintaining absolute standards. They trusted his judgment implicitly, knowing he'd never act dishonorably. Thomas felt the weight of history pressing down on him. This moment would define not just his career, but his legacy. His decision would ripple outward, affecting his daughter's pride in her father, his colleagues' faith in their institution, and perhaps even international relations between two powerful nations. The crowd fell silent as they sensed the climax approaching. Even the London traffic seemed to quiet, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Thomas looked at Petrov, really looked at him, and saw past the expensive clothes and diplomatic armor to the frightened father underneath. For a moment, the guard allowed himself to imagine what he would do if Emma was in danger, if protocol stood between him and saving his child. The thought sent ice through his veins, but it also clarified his understanding of duty. True honor sometimes meant making the hardest choice, not the easiest one. The morning sun reached its peak, casting sharp shadows across the palace courtyard. In that golden light, Thomas made his decision, one that would echo through diplomatic circles, social media, and history books. He would speak, but his words would carry the wisdom of a Welsh miner's son, the authority of 23 years of faithful service, and the compassion of a father who understood love transcends all boundaries. The moment hung suspended like a held breath, waiting for Thomas Mitchell to change the world with a single word. Thomas looked directly into Viktor Petrov's eyes for the first time. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. A guard who had maintained perfect stillness for hours finally acknowledging the man before him as a human being, rather than merely a problem to be endured. "No," Thomas said. The word carried 23 years of unwavering service, generations of Welsh mining family honor, and the absolute certainty of a man who knew exactly where he stood. It wasn't spoken with anger or spite, but with the quiet authority of someone who understood that some principles couldn't be negotiated away, even for the most sympathetic reasons. Petrov staggered backward as if struck. He'd expected many responses, anger, threats, even violence, but not this calm, compassionate refusal from a man who clearly understood his desperation. The crowd erupted in whispered conversations, their phones capturing and sharing the moment across continents. Within minutes, the video began spreading through social media with unprecedented speed. #Royal Guard response started trending as people shared the clip of a simple soldier choosing duty over sympathy, honor over convenience. Thomas felt a strange peace settle over him. He'd spoken his truth, upheld his oath, and remained faithful to everything his uniform represented. The consequences would come, they always did, but his conscience was clear. "I have a daughter too," Thomas said quietly, his voice meant only for Petrov's ears. "I understand your fear. But I cannot abandon my post, not even for that." Something shifted in the ambassador's face, recognition, perhaps, or respect for a man who would sacrifice personal comfort for principle. Petrov had spent his career among politicians and diplomats who bent rules when convenient, who traded favors and compromised positions for advantage. Here stood someone different. Palace security moved closer, but their commanding officer held up a hand, recognizing that Thomas had handled the situation with perfect judgment. The crisis was resolving itself not through force or further escalation, but through honest communication between two fathers on opposite sides of an impossible situation. Petrov's phone rang again. This time, when he answered, his conversation was brief and ended with visible relief flooding his features. Whatever crisis had driven his urgency had apparently found another solution. His daughter was safe. "Thank you," Petrov said to Thomas, the words carrying unexpected sincerity. "You showed me something today I'd forgotten, that honor isn't negotiable, even when everything else is falling apart." The ambassador straightened his coat and walked back toward his waiting car, but paused to address the crowd of tourists who'd witnessed the entire encounter. "This man," he called out, gesturing toward Thomas, "represents the best of what your country stands for. I hope you appreciate him." The crowd broke into spontaneous applause, Americans, Britons, tourists from around the world united in admiration for a guard who'd chosen principle over expediency. Thomas felt his cheeks warm with embarrassment and pride. A young American veteran stepped forward from the crowd, his eyes misty with emotion. "Thank you, soldier," he said, extending his hand. "You reminded me why I served." The handshake was firm, meaningful, a connection between warriors separated by nationality but united by understanding of duty's weight. An elderly British woman approached next, her walking stick tapping against the cobblestones. "My husband served in the war," she said softly. "He would have been proud to stand beside you." She pressed a small poppy pin into Thomas's gloved hand, a symbol of remembrance that felt heavier than gold. If you've been enjoying this story, Subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. As the black Mercedes pulled away, Thomas resumed his perfect stillness, but something had changed. The tourists no longer saw just another uniformed figure. They saw a man who'd proven that ordinary people could stand for extraordinary principles. Children pointed at him with awe, parents explained the importance of duty and honor, and elderly visitors nodded with understanding born from their own experiences with sacrifice. The morning mist had burned away completely, leaving crystal-clear autumn air that carried the sounds of London awakening to a new day. Thomas thought of his father, wondering if the old miner would have been proud of his son's moment of testing. He thought of Margaret, whose memory had given him strength when he needed it most. And he thought of Emma, hoping she'd understand that sometimes love means standing firm rather than giving in. The palace grounds returned to their normal rhythm, but the ripples of Thomas's simple no continued spreading outward through the digital world. News outlets picked up the story, diplomatic circles buzzed with discussion, and ordinary people shared the video with friends and family, explaining why this moment mattered in a world that seemed increasingly willing to compromise its principles. A young girl broke free from her parents and ran toward Thomas, clutching a small British flag. "For you, sir," she said with a gap-toothed smile before scampering back to safety. Thomas felt his heart swell with unexpected joy. This child understood something pure about service and sacrifice that adults sometimes forgot. Thomas Mitchell had become more than a royal guard. He'd become a reminder that integrity still existed, that some people still chose the difficult right over the convenient wrong. But all of that remained in the future, waiting to unfold. For now, he simply stood at his post, faithful as always, watching over a palace that represented centuries of tradition protected by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. 3 weeks later, Thomas received an unexpected visitor during his off-duty hours. Emma arrived at his small flat in South London carrying a newspaper and wearing the brightest smile he'd seen since Margaret's passing. The headline read, "Royal Guard's Response Inspires International Discussion on Honor and Duty." "Dad," she said, settling into the worn armchair that had been her mother's favorite, "do you realize you're famous?" Thomas chuckled, uncomfortable with the attention but pleased to see his daughter's pride. "I just did my job, love. Same as always." But Emma shook her head, spreading the newspaper across the kitchen table where they'd shared countless meals over the years. The article featured quotes from diplomats, military officials, and ordinary citizens from around the world. People were calling Thomas's response a masterclass in principled leadership, a reminder that honor wasn't dead in the modern world. "Listen to this," Emma read aloud. From the American ambassador to the UK, Sergeant Mitchell's response demonstrated that true strength comes from unwavering principles, not flexible convenience. The world needs more people willing to stand firm when it matters most. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. He'd never sought recognition, only to serve faithfully. But as Emma continued reading testimonials from around the globe, he began to understand that his simple no had touched something deeper than diplomacy or protocol. A letter arrived the following day, bearing the palace seal. Thomas opened it with trembling hands, expecting either commendation or reprimand. Instead, he found a personal note from the Queen herself, thanking him for upholding the finest traditions of her guard and representing the values that made their institution worthy of respect. More surprising was a second letter, this one from Viktor Petrov. The Russian ambassador had written to apologize for his behavior and to explain that his daughter had indeed been in danger, kidnapped while studying abroad, but had been safely recovered through proper diplomatic channels while Thomas maintained his post. Petrov's letter concluded with words that stayed with Thomas for years. "You taught me that a man's character is revealed not in how he treats his equals, but in how he responds when pressure would justify compromise." The video of their encounter had indeed gone viral, shared millions of times across every social platform Emma had tried to explain to him. Comments poured in from veterans who understood the weight of duty, from parents who appreciated his example, and from young people who'd never seen someone choose principle over popularity. One comment particularly moved Thomas. A teenager from Wales wrote, "My granddad was a coal miner like your dad probably was. He always said the measure of a man isn't what he does when people are watching, but what he does when no one would blame him for taking the easy path. You showed us what he meant." Thomas thought often about that phrase in the weeks that followed. The easy path would have been to step aside, to avoid conflict, to let someone else make the difficult decision. But his father's voice echoed through the years. When someone tries to make you small, son, stand taller. Emma visited more frequently after the incident, bringing grandchildren Thomas had rarely seen during his years of rigid duty schedules. His 4-year-old grandson, little James, insisted on playing Royal Guard in the small garden behind Thomas's flat, standing at attention for impressively long periods before dissolving into giggles. "Why didn't you move, Granddad?" James asked one afternoon, his innocent question cutting straight to the heart of everything. Thomas knelt beside the boy, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes, James, people need to know that some things don't change just because someone wants them to. Like how much I love you, or how important it is to keep promises, or how good people take care of special places." The child nodded solemnly, then returned to his game with renewed determination. Letters continued arriving from around the world, from military families who understood sacrifice, from elderly couples who remembered when keeping one's word mattered, from young parents trying to teach their children about integrity. Each message reinforced that Thomas's moment of decision had resonated far beyond the palace gates. A particularly touching letter came from a group of Welsh miners' children, now adults themselves, who wrote, "Our fathers would have recognized something in you that day. The backbone of men who know their worth isn't measured in compromise. You carried our heritage with honor." The BBC requested interviews, publishers inquired about book deals, and speaking engagements were offered at military academies worldwide. Thomas politely declined them all, understanding that his power lay not in words but in actions, not in explanations but in example. Months passed, and Thomas continued his service with the same dedication he'd shown for over 2 decades. But something had shifted in how people saw him, and perhaps in how he saw himself. He'd become proof that ordinary people could uphold extraordinary principles, that honor wasn't an old-fashioned concept but a living choice made fresh each day. The morning mist still clung to the palace cobblestones, tourists still gathered with their cameras, and diplomats still arrived with varying degrees of courtesy. But Thomas carried with him now the knowledge that his father's values, Margaret's love, and Emma's pride had combined in a single moment to create something larger than himself. Young guards sought his counsel, asking how to maintain integrity when the world seemed determined to erode it. Thomas would tell them about coal miners who never bent their backs except to work, about a wife who believed in standing for something greater than yourself, and about the quiet satisfaction that comes from sleeping peacefully when you've chosen principle over convenience. On quiet mornings, when the palace grounds were peaceful and the weight of history felt particularly present, Thomas would think about that autumn day when a simple no changed everything. He'd stood firm not just for protocol or tradition, but for the belief that some principles were worth preserving, regardless of the cost. The world needed people willing to hold the line, to stand guard over values that made civilization possible. Thomas Mitchell had proven he was one of them, and in doing so, had inspired countless others to find their own moments of quiet courage. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thank you for joining us on this journey of honor, duty, and the quiet courage that makes heroes of us all.